All right. Hello, everyone. First, I want to thank Anonymous and Jacob MM for the donations while we were in the transition period. Hello, hello. About the portfolio reviews, we have limited time per session, but Shores has other portfolio review sessions tomorrow as well. But for specifics, yeah, please email Tuatara at the link that Thomas sent, and we'll get back to you. Thank you. All right. Waiting a little bit for more people to trickle in, but I think we are good to start. All right, welcome to Effect Like a Painter, the Christmas edition. Okay. So first I want to introduce myself. My name is Andrew. I'm a Texas-based VFX artist, and these are some of the projects I've worked on. So why Effect Like a Painter? So you may have heard that real-time VFX is a combination of art and technology. And this is very true. I think it's a very beautiful marriage of composing together visual design and modern digital tools, math, all that kind of stuff together. And so when thinking about how we want to improve or learn VFX, what areas should we study? Of course, obviously, right, you can take courses, do tutorials, right, study games. Those are the obvious ones, but I would like to propose, in addition to that, it's really beneficial as a supplement to study art, right? And in particular, one way to study to be a better VFX artist is to actually just look at traditional painting. By looking at traditional painting, we're able to take inspiration from their processes, right? See how different artists approach new pieces, see how that differs to how you might approach a new effect. You can see how they observe the natural world, see how they interpret forms, see how they derive meaning from the subject matters that they paint from. Look into their techniques. We can learn skills that are generically applicable to any art form, such as composition, color theory, shape design, all that good stuff. Through various artists, if you study art history, you can look at their training processes, see how they practice, see how they study, and maybe take some learnings from that. But most importantly, I would like to talk about their thinking and how important it is by learning from others and how they think, other artists, other creatives, right? You can develop a deeper understanding of how people in general digest and interpret work, whether it's games or painting. And, it's something that can't really be taught in a tutorial. So why is painting relevant? I'd like to argue that when making games, just like any other art form, it's a vehicle for communication. It's a way for us to share unique experiences that, in games especially, are shared amongst communities, to tell stories, and for us to express emotion, right? And painting is a great candidate for this because it had such a long history. We can literally derive from the extent of human history. And because of its contrast to the digital medium, we can look past sort of the surface level characteristics of the medium and look more closely at sort of the philosophy behind things, and also look at I guess the more abstract approach to creating work in general, and studying painting is just really cool, so I think it's worthwhile either way. So today we will first look at a few artists and a few of their paintings. We'll take a few notes, maybe get some ideas, and then try to bring it back to our VFX work. And this is the Christmas edition because we'll be bringing it back to make this little cozy fireplace scene. Just to note, this is not a highly technical talk. We just don't really have the time here. And my goal here is more so to just explore ideas, to introduce you to some paintings for those that aren't familiar with these works. Hopefully it's a nice introduction. And if not, I hope you guys just find, some interesting ideas from this. For more technical information, if you want to see some nodes, Jerry has a great presentation tomorrow, Math But Make It Cuter. But for today, we will hopefully just have some fun looking at paintings. So the first painter I want to talk about is John Singer Sargent. Anyone that's familiar with kind of modern illustration or familiar with learning painting in the traditional sense would definitely study Sargent and would definitely would probably likely say that Sargent is one of their favorite painters just because of the sort of raw skill that this man has. The amount of rendering, he's famous for his oil paintings and portraiture in particular, but he also has so many plein air paintings like landscapes, murals, and even watercolors, right? And during his time as an artist, he was also amongst a lot of other influential artists that you definitely know, such as Monet, right? Degas, Whistler, just to name a few. And something I'll touch on a bit later as well is his techniques in terms of alla prima and his impressionism influences. Alla prima as in the application of paint directly without a sketch, and impressionism, although he wasn't directly impressionistic, he has definitely some techniques that draw from that style. So looking at his body of work, on the top left we have a painting he did of Monet. Bottom middle, we have one of his watercolors. And then on the top right is one of my favorite paintings of his as well. And when we take a look at his body of work in general, of course, this is sort of a broad range, try to give you a kind of bigger picture, not just of his oils, but also of his sketchier oils and also his watercolors. But he really has an incredible grasp of focus, of interest, of composition, all of that stuff, right? So this painting of Monet is very, very loose and sketchy. The areas that are less important, since he's painting this live, right, outdoors, plein air, he sort of, generalizes the grass and the foliage, and he focuses in on having the shapes and the definition of the figures of, Monet in particular in his painting. Same with this watercolor where the borders are blended and so watery and soft, almost to come together as a vignette, while the highlights are sharp and bright. And something interesting about this piece as well is that it exposes for the darks, right? If anyone's familiar with photography and the way that colors and color spaces work, the way that this is composed is that the lights are grouped together into almost solid forms. They're very, very bright, but that allows us to have more values to work with in the darks so that we have more details in the shadows. And then on the top right is definitely one of his more developed paintings. And this one just has wonderful softness in the cloth, sharp detailed shapes in the grass, nice shape design in the floating flowers up here. Compositionally, it's also quite interesting. It feels almost like a mirror between the two figures, despite it being actually two separate girls, which is obvious if you look closer, but is something that just, there's more to see, more to discover as you look deeper into his paintings, right? But I want to focus on one painting in particular, and one of my favorite paintings of his, which is The Fountain. This painting is incredible to see in person, and is much smaller than you might think. At a distance, it does feel quite realistic, right? The lighting, the exposure, it really draws from like photography even, where the colors and stuff really do feel grounded. But looking closer at these close-ups that I've sort of broken out, you really see how abstract and sort of dynamic the rendering of stuff is, right? The flat surfaces of the pillar, for example, are grouped up and has a lot of color variation for how simple the surface should be. Same with the foliage in the background. There's all different kinds of hues and tones. There's yellower greens, bluer greens, oranges, browns, blues, all of that. And then, looking at the dress even, it contours the form using brushstrokes while keeping areas of rest simple, but also still defining very distinct folds with very few brushstrokes. And so, looking at the brushwork, looking how it complements the gesture, but mainly focusing on how he adds variation to simple or complex forms. Doing more with less is sort of what I'm alluding at here. So yeah, so now taking kind of our observations here, let's start making fire. This is the scene that we're starting with, just a simple environment with some lighting, but a dark and sad fireplace. So in order to add fire, how do we start? Well, I guess if you're a beginner or if you're first starting out your VFX journey, you might search up some tutorials and you might end up somewhere here, which is a very, very basic particle fire. And this works, and I think at a distance it definitely works as well. It definitely gives the impression of fire, but we can definitely improve from this point. So yeah, this is just a single texture on a particle system. But I would say that this is quite even. You can clearly see the individual particles because of how even it is. It lacks a sort of flow of fire. Of course, since fire is a gas and gases are a liquid, there's sort of a natural flow to things that this is sort of missing. And just from an artistic perspective, there's a lack of negative space, a lack of various sizes of shapes, and kind of ends up as sort of a boring and uninteresting effect, especially since this is the centerpiece of the scene, right? And so how do we go about this? How do we find a way to bring in more variation, but with less, right? Just like how Sargent is doing. So the approach that I took here as an iteration is to just use less particles and rely more on the shader. Thanks everyone for the donations. I'll probably read out all the donations at the very end. But yes, they're seen and I appreciate them. We appreciate them. It's for a great cause. But yeah, so this is just a really simple texture with some distortion on it. And immediately, you're able to art direct this better, right? You're able to have more negative space. You're able to have better, distinguished movement from bottom to top. You're able to have more variation from just within this area in general. And yeah, just with less, you're doing more. There's more interest, more variation, and I think in general it's a better result. And not to mention, with this technique as well, you have more artistic control. Now, speaking of landscapes, or not speaking of landscapes, but speaking of Sargent, he also did landscapes, right? And here we have one of his landscapes, and on the right we have one of Monet's famous water lilies. And I put them together because they were associated, like they were acquainted with each other, but we're not here specifically to talk about Monet today. I'd like to focus more on other landscape painters. In particular, I'd like to introduce you guys to the American landscape painters of around the 19th century, right? And you can immediately see, just from comparing like these paintings to these paintings, just the sort of different approach people have, whether from their different backgrounds or from their different opinions or views of the world. You can see that through their painting, and they express that, right? Here, the paintings are more epic, more grand, there's more vast, whereas here they're more colorful, more dynamic. It's just it's very interesting to see the sort of differences between approaches. My favorites amongst these are Thomas Cole and Winslow Homer. Homer especially has these really nice, soft paintings, but still full of color, despite being really muted in general. But to focus in on one of them, I want to focus in on George N.S. He was highly influenced by the painters in the last slide, the Hudson River School painters, and he traveled across America and Europe both to study painting. He's known for his soft versus sharp shapes. You can see here in the clouds, there are these edges, and then it fades out into the atmosphere. Same with the trees. But rather than his big, grand, detailed paintings, I like to more focus on his softer paintings later in life. And these paintings are interesting because they are very, very simple in nature, right? They're basically just silhouettes, but they have a lot of color variation and textural variation inside those shapes. Without being overly blotchy, there is various greens and browns and all sorts of colors within these shapes, right? Of course, I also included one of his really, really highly detailed landscapes as a comparison, but the sort of contrast between highly, highly detailed and, sort of technical painting versus more sort of abstracted but also expression-based painting, right? But importantly, what I want to draw from here is sort of adding interest within something that is inherently relatively simple, right? I also want to add in one other painter, not necessarily a American painter. He's actually British, in fact, is John Constable. I include him because he's my favorite landscape painter, but he also, relates to this idea of adding interest within simplicity. Here is one of his more detailed big paintings, but I'm more interested in sort of these sketches that he's done, where he's really simplified his forms in terms of the trees and foliage, right? They almost look really, really solid, in fact, but he's able to add those sort of variations in sort of texture and also color in order to give that impression of leaves, right? And this is sort of a result of process. You can clearly tell that a lot of this color variation is actually just from underpainting, or like from the umbers and ochres that he started out with. But it's a result of the process, but still intentional in terms of the result that it gives, which is just a more interesting painting within simpler forms. This painting I want to focus in on in particular, which is Stoke by Nayland. And this painting in person is also just an incredible experience in terms of how different it feels in person to online, or like on the screen, right? And this is also something that I would like to emphasize in terms of learning from disciplines outside of your own or adjacent to your own, which is you really have a vastly different experience because of the difference in medium. And through that experience, you can really take in a lot more different ideas compared to if you just stuck with what you knew, right? So, for example, this painting in person looks dramatically different from this image. This image is it's well photographed. You can see all the details, but in person, you almost don't see anything within this bottom half. This whole area is so dark and the sky is so bright. It almost feels like you're standing outside. The first time I saw this painting, I didn't even notice the horses or the carriage or the people. Like, all of this was just lost to me because of how, I mean this in the best way possible, how messy and grungy everything is. And that's also something that I want to touch on, which is similar to George Inness, which we talked about earlier, which is just the sort of interest that he adds within these colors. You can see in the sky here how sort of grungy and sort of random a lot of the accidental colors are in here. There's greens even, there's browns, there's reds, and the blues are very muted. It streaks into grays, right? And of course, you might assume this is an accident, and partly it is in terms of, you just look at his palette, right? It's relatively messy in that sense. But at the same time, he paints through this process intentionally in order to get this sort of effect. And the reason why this effect is so powerful is just when you're seeing this painting at a distance or in person or through like a thumbnail, for example, it all comes together and it adds a level of like muted realism to things, but also it maintains that sort of textural interest that that is just nice to see when you zoom in, right? It is sort of not covering up the core impact of things, right? The initial intent, like these are definitely clouds, but it's obvious and clear enough to where it still adds that level of interest. And so how do we add more interest to this fire? Currently it's pretty static and relatively simple. You can still kind of clearly tell that this is sort of detached from the scene itself, right? It doesn't necessarily integrate super well with the fireplace or the environment, right? And it lacks what I call sort of the blending with the environment, right? So some ideas, not necessarily exactly similar to painting, but some ideas that we can take advantage of, like hue shifting, different value changes, adding, more interesting distortion using different textures, adding various scales to these particles. these can all be very effective, right? But we can extrapolate this further because we have the advantage of time. And I believe that interesting effects should almost always stay in motion and change over time, right? And that way, when you do pause things or stop things or have impact frames or whatever, it has more of an impact because things are so dynamic around it. And so looking at this, I think the easiest approach to sort of have a significant improvement here, actually, is something that may not be super noticeable at first glance. So compared to the last video, I wonder if anyone can actually notice a difference at first glance here. But I know for a fact that you guys can feel the difference. This is one of those things that is not necessarily obvious at first glance, but when pointed out, you really do see the difference between the earlier version and this one. And yep. Dynamic lighting is correct. So we added some light flickering. It's very, very simple, just basic material function with some, or not material, light function with some noise, just to add some flickering. And although simple, it really, really does ground the effect more. It attaches sort of the environment to the effect, or I guess it attaches the effect to the environment in a way where it feels like they live in the same world. You know, the light was already doing quite a bit. It would look way worse without the point light, but having that flickering just adds that additional level of interest, right? Similar to how painters just add little bits of color or accidental smears, grays, browns, blacks, you know. We could also add more hue variation here, but if we don't want to go with the hue variation route, we can take advantage of our medium by using time, by using, light and this kind of thing. All right, the last artist I want to talk about is Georgia O'Keeffe. Anyone familiar with modern painting would definitely know of Georgia O'Keeffe. She is probably one of, if not the most impactful female artists. During her time, just incredible impact, and her paintings throughout her long career, several decades, really reflected her life, reflected the time period that she lived in, and reflected just American culture in general. Mainly landscapes, flowers, urban and like southern, western sort of iconography. And you can really see the sort of time period through her paintings. So just to give a brief overview of some of her body of work, we have Blue and Green Music over here. We have a painting of New York, and then we have one of her landscapes. And you can really see in a lot of these just the sort of abstraction influences, but also influences specifically of the places that she's lived before. Blue and Green Music in particular just has really great shape design, and but I don't really want to focus necessarily on the technique. I would rather instead focus on how her paintings and work reflects on her as an artist, right? And so bringing it back to sort of landscapes that we were talking about earlier, we have Sky Above the Clouds. And this is probably well known as her magnum opus. We could say that. And yes, it is very, very simple. But if you take a look at the bottom left and look at the size, it is massive. It is so huge. Just huge. You can fit like maybe a dozen people on this painting in general. And yeah, I think there's a few things that you can really note about this painting, and a lot of things that aren't initially obvious. So from the name, if you do read the name and then you look at the painting, it's like, okay, these are clouds. But they are very, very simplified, minimalistic clouds. And they're not the most interesting on their own necessarily, right? I guess she just painted some clouds is maybe what you might say. You might also interpret this as a different subject matter. But the important thing about this painting is that, well, first off, as is with most modern painting, you have to paint in series. So it's a series, it's throughout over almost a decade. She painted 11 of these, a bunch of them, but this one was the penultimate big one, right? Biggest painting she's ever done, huge. But why does this even matter? Like, why is this painting significant? Georgia O'Keeffe worked and lived throughout sort of what is known as the jet age, which is when commercial flights first started happening. And this perspective and this view of the world was very, very unique for that time, right? Humans have never really seen this view before and was somewhat alien to them before this period of time, before, the Wright brothers. And through those experiences of flying and looking out the window and seeing this, there was sort of this new, this passion to capture this view, right? And in doing so, she went with this, and of course, because she's inspired and comes from abstraction, this sort of minimalistic, symbolic, like iconographic sort of approach, right? Rather than, trying to represent the clouds one-to-one, it's almost as if it's like, when you ask a child to draw a tree or to draw a cloud, you would just draw this white blob. And it's immediately recognizable by people. It immediately resonates with people just because of its simplicity, right? And also important to note that she has some sort of degenerative eyesight issue that she experienced throughout her later ages. And so a bunch of the paintings later on in life, including this one, was when she was starting to lose vision. And so I think most of these are still unassisted. She still painted these herself. But just really reflects sort of her interpretation and view of these views, right? As she's aging and as society is innovating in terms of planes and air travel, but also just how simple and direct the communication aspect of this is. So the point I kind of want to make here is to not really overcomplicate things. When you want to communicate something, when you want to sort of showcase an experience or an imagery or a view, sometimes just go with the most obvious and direct approach, and it really just is the most effective, right? And if that doesn't work, then you can go on and try to problem solve and figure out more complex ways. But symbols are very powerful in storytelling. Just how this white blob is a cloud. Things like logos and emojis are sometimes just the most direct way to express how you think and feel, right? So for example, this is my only game example here, is in Hades 2, we have these sort of light halos. Generically, in most of the areas, there's just this sort of round halo around all the lights, and stylistically it fits and it looks really nice. But in areas of, and no spoilers, but in areas of the unseen, where the goddess of the moon has influence over the area, all of the halos are instead moon-shaped. And this shape of halo makes pretty much no sense in context to the source of light. But because of the way that they have the art style sort of set up, and because of the theming of everything, they're allowed to sort of add in these really, really obvious and distinct crescent patterns everywhere, and just to really hammer in the fact that this is influenced by the moon, right? And so oftentimes when you're at a loss in terms of thinking of how should I approach this effect, how should I improve this effect, where should I even go, if you don't have a concept especially, then this is a really great way to sort of start off your ideas, right? It's difficult to start with a blank slate. Starting with the most obvious and sort of iconographic approach is oftentimes the simplest, right? And so looking at this effect that we have, how do we improve this more? I think the last thing that this is really missing is sort of now that we have it interacting with the environment and also with this one's not flickering, but imagine this one's still flickering. But the flames themselves aren't really interacting with the logs. They're not really interacting with the shape of the fireplace. And then, just generally it's still sort of vertical and sort of boring in that way, right? And so there are a few options that we can go with. We can try to add in that behavior through the shader even more, or we can go with a Niagara-based approach, try to mess with forces, mess with a more technical approach. However, because we're trying to go with something more direct here, let's go with a custom mesh shape instead. Because this is a one-off, it's not really something that's supposed to be generically used elsewhere. It's sort of tailored to this prop. We can literally make a mesh that is shaped to the fireplace. And so instead of spawning in particles, instead we spawn in the single mesh with the shape that we want. We can very, very easily sort of get that motion and that directionality without, delving into the technical aspect of things. And so the final fire here is pretty similar to the thing before, and I kept the implementation as simple as possible, so we're not doing anything super fancy here. It's still just a distorted texture, and but we get that sort of directionality. We get that wrapping around of the fireplace. We get that inserting in between the sort of logs, and it just sort of works. And we don't really have to think too much deeper about it if it does. And if it didn't work, we could look at other options. But sometimes the most direct approach is the best approach, right? And so, yeah, looking at sort of a breakdown. Also, the texture I used literally is a fire emoji, right? Like we really don't need to overthink this. Many people have told me that they struggle with textures, especially things like noise, things like the source texture. Like, how do we even, think about okay, how do we make an interesting noise? How do we make an interesting fire texture? That's something that can be iterated on and improved over time, but we need a starting point, right? And so starting like this is perfectly valid. And something else that I want to point out is that interpretation is king, right? So even there's many things here even that I could criticize, but at a distance, this feels decent and it feels dynamic and it feels like fire, right? And that's really what's important. That's where you want to be in the beginning. Even for the most realistic sims, it's impossible to simulate every atom in the universe, right? And you can ask a bunch of the talented Houdini artists everywhere. They still use forces and stuff in a quote unnatural way, just for the sake of art direction and for the sake of more interesting effects, right? Just go with your gut, go with how you interpret things, what you think would make sense in the context, and I think the result can speak for itself, right? All right, final thing I want to leave off with before we go into sort of a Q&A, if there's any questions, is I just talked about painting today, but the sort of core message that I want to give is to just learn from the world, right? On the art side, don't just learn from VFX or painting, learn from sculpture, music, writing, go as abstract and just go with what you find interesting, right? You can really find parallels and areas of learning from any art form, really. From the sculpture, you can really focus in on those shape designs. You can focus in on volume. For music, you can focus on their workflow, their emotions, you can try to connect timing to rhythm, that kind of thing. Just there are infinite ways to learn on that end. And on the flip side, of course, talked about art, but there's also the tech aspect of things, right? Having some programming, learning from the physical world, learning from science, any sort of subject matter that you might make an effect for, I don't know, watch a documentary or watch a explanation of how it works. If you're doing the trails for a plane, researching vortices and how the wingtips create these trails is really helpful as well. And you can sort of connect those two together to sort of define your approach to things, right? And as always, everything I'm saying today is just one way of doing things, one idea, but I hope it sort of gives you just a starting point in terms of studying painting and also studying things in general. I believe in sort of intuitive learning, and so looking at things not just in terms of, oh, do this because it works, but instead people do this or other artists do this because it gives this effect, I think is a much more interesting and also much more intuitive way of learning things. So yeah, thank you. This is the final effect. Zoomed out to match the concept art, right? All right. Nice. I hit the sort of 35-ish minutes that I was aiming for. Um, and yeah, these are the sources I used, all the galleries that I pulled paintings from. So yeah, I think we have around 15 minutes if anyone has any questions, or if anyone wants to see a little bit more of the nitty gritty, I can also pull some things up, the Blender file or the Unreal file, if anyone's interested. But yeah. First I'll list out a bunch of these donations. So during our presentation today, we had Andrew Chen, #1 fan, thank you for the 5. Van Gogh's ear, thank you for the 20. Canadian Corn Dog, thanks for the 50. Caroline Pierrot, thanks for the 20. Thank you everybody for supporting Child's Play. Let's see. How can you develop the skill to critically analyze painting to better your VFX? Well, I think this is kind of a two-parter, right? The first thing is to just like expose yourself to the thing. If you're interested in anything, just expose yourself to the thing, right? So just look at more paintings, and you develop opinions and develop sort of an eye for it the more you see it, right? But the second thing is, if you want more direction on having sort of like, oh, like where is this from? Like where's the thought process behind this? What's the techniques? Paintings are nice to study because they have so many learning resources, right? Like museums always have that little plaque next to them. Note down the names of the artists, go back, read their history, see how their experiences in life kind of relates to their painting, but then also like break it down into, okay, this is their medium, this is their like who they are, so like study them, and then also study their medium. So if they're an oil painter, go back and study oil painting, and then go back and look at the oil painting that they did, and then try to connect them, right? Breaking things down into what they did, who they are, this kind of thing can help you sort of find a clear path to better analyzing paintings, right? Thank you, AB, for the $5. All right. If there's no other questions, then I can start wrapping up. And then after this will be, I think it's Evan's programming doors, which will be a really fun sort of technical programming talk, but also like a playful thing. I'm pretty sure he's doing some experimentation there as well. Yes, that's the full stream schedule. But yeah, you know, because everyone else is doing a lot more technical stuff, I hope this was a nice sort of theoretical, artistic talk, and maybe you guys found something fun about it. And yeah, if any additional questions, or if you guys would like to see a breakdown of the actual shaders or the scene or the level, the Unreal file, for example, feel free to message Tuatara. And yeah, stay tuned for Evan's presentation on doors. All right, thank you guys.